Hello and welcome to The Last Climb. Now, what do you think happens when you treat the world's most lethal mountain like a company bonus? One family found that out the hard way. Sherpas saw every red flag from miles away, but arrogance and denial drove every bad decision until someone's future lay shattered at base camp. It was May 3, 2023. Lukla, Nepal. The moment Theron Holt stepped off the 9-seater turboprop at Tenzing Hillary Airport, he was already the loudest thing on the mountain. Theron Holt was 48 years old, 220 pounds, and had spent the better part of 2 decades as a financial executive on Wall Street. He was the kind of man who treated every room like a boardroom and every person in it like a subordinate. When he arrived in Lukla, Theron was equipped with brand new mountaineering gear and carried a summit certificate from Kilimanjaro, which he often cited as evidence of his climbing experience. He projected confidence and quickly assumed a leadership role within the group. His wife, Solveig, 46, had also purchased quality gear and researched the trek beforehand. She was generally cautious, but she tended to defer to Theron's decisions. By the time they reached Nepal, that dynamic was well established. She was already feeling unusually winded during the short walk from the Lukla airstrip, despite the town's relatively modest elevation of 9,383 feet. I want you to picture that situation. That is not even base camp. This is just where the trekking starts. Their daughter, Maren, was 17, 5'6", 120 pounds, with a small pack on her back and a blank expression that I kept coming back to when I went through the expedition records. She followed her father without being asked. She did not speak to the porters. She did not complain. She just existed in the space Theron had carved out for her and moved through the trip the way someone moves through something they did not choose. I found no record of her voicing any objection to the climb. I found no record of her voicing much of anything at all. The family's lead Sherpa, Pasang Dorje, was a veteran Everest guide with years of experience leading foreign climbers. From the start of the trek to base camp, he paid close attention to the Holt family and their condition at altitude. The route from Lukla to Everest Base Camp serves as both a trek and an acclimatization process, allowing climbers time to adapt to decreasing oxygen levels. Proper acclimatization is critical. Without it, the risk of serious altitude illness rises sharply. At Namche Bazaar, Pasang checked Solveig's blood oxygen saturation with a pulse oximeter. It read 82%, a low but not unusual value for someone recently arrived from sea level. Now, I think the real question is whether the number recovers after 2 days rest. Still, he noted that her recovery after rest was sluggish. After 48 hours at Namche, her numbers had barely improved, hovering in the low 80s. Pasang logged it and said nothing to the family yet. He was watching. Theron noticed none of this. He spent the 2 rest days at Namche eating enormous amounts of dalbat, posting updates to what I can only assume was a very engaged LinkedIn audience, and complaining loudly about the pace of the acclimatization schedule to anyone who would listen. At Dingboche, 14,469 feet, the itinerary called for a second scheduled rest day. Theron told Pasang they were skipping it. He had paid $45,000 for a summit attempt, and he was not going to spend an extra day at 14,000 feet doing nothing. Pasang walked him through the physiology. He explained patiently and in plain language what the rest day was actually doing for their bodies. Theron thanked him for the input and said they were moving up the next morning. Pasang said nothing more. He packed his kit. That was the first major red flag. I really wish it was the last, but we're just getting started. Maren started coughing at Lobusha, 16,207 feet. It was a dry, hollow cough, the kind that sounds like someone knocking on an empty wooden door. She was careful about it. Every time someone looked her way, she turned slightly and brought her hand to her mouth. She hid it the way teenagers hide things they know will cause a problem. Everest Base Camp sits at 17,598 feet beside the Khumbu Glacier. During the spring climbing season, it becomes a temporary city of tents, equipment, and support staff as hundreds of climbers from around the world gather there to prepare for summit attempts. Before any Sherpa team begins climbing, they hold a puja ceremony, a Buddhist blessing performed by a lama that asks the mountain for safe passage. It is not optional. It is not a formality you can have perform. It is a ritual the Sherpa community takes seriously, and for good reason. These are the people who die on this mountain at a rate that is genuinely staggering. If you didn't know, a Sherpa guide is statistically about 10 times more likely to be killed on Everest than a foreign client. The ceremony matters to them in the way that things matter when your life depends on them. Theron did not remove his boots during the altar preparation. This was not ignorance. The guide service had sent a pre-expedition document that covered the puja ceremony in considerable detail. He just did not bother. He also checked his watch twice during the Lama's blessing. I want you to sit with that for a moment. He checked his watch during a prayer being said for his own survival. That night, after the ceremony, Pasang and his two other Sherpas, Tendi Norbu, 28, assigned primarily to the mother, and Lakpa Chairing, 41, the most experienced of the three, with 11 summits gathered outside the cook tent. They spoke in Nepali. Tendi said Solveig's fingernails had a faint blue tint to them, even while she was sitting still. Not during exertion at rest. Lakpa said Marin's cough did not sound like dryness or dust irritation. It sounded like something deeper, something fluid. Pasang tied a fresh kata scarf around his neck, a ceremonial Tibetan scarf, and said nothing. There was nothing to say. They all knew what they were looking at. The standard acclimatization strategy on Everest is called climb high, sleep low. You go up to stress the body at altitude, then come back down to let it adapt while you rest at a lower elevation. You do this in rotations, spending a night or two at progressively higher camps before returning to base camp and recovering before the actual summit push. The whole process takes weeks and cannot be meaningfully rushed. The Khumbu Icefall is the first major challenge above base camp and one of the most hazardous sections of the Everest route. This constantly shifting glacier is filled with deep crevasses and unstable ice towers that can collapse without warning. Climbers typically cross it before dawn to reduce exposure to warming temperatures, but even with fixed ladders and established routes, it remains an inherently dangerous environment. Now, would you be surprised if I said Theron moved through it at near sprint? He outpaced his Sherpa on the very first rotation, charging ahead on the fixed lines with the energy of a man who had no idea what the next 6 hours were going to cost him physically. He did not wait for ladder crossings to be confirmed stable before stepping onto them. At one point, he stepped over an open crevasse without clipping his harness into the fixed safety line, the one non-negotiable rule of the icefall, the rope that is the only thing between a climber and a fall, into a slot in the glacier. Tendi shouted at him from 30 feet back. Theron turned around and waved. 3 other climbers from a different team witnessed this and said nothing, which is its own kind of horror. At Camp 1, 19,500 feet, Pasang measured Solveig's blood oxygen saturation again. 78% borderline, but not yet catastrophic. To give that number some context, most people at that altitude will read in the low 80s. This was a clear warning, but not yet an emergency. Pasang told Solveig directly that she needed to monitor her symptoms closely. Solveig turned and looked at Theron. Theron said she was fine. Pasang told Solveig directly and clearly that she needed to descend back to base camp for 2 additional rest days. He said her body was not keeping up with the altitude gain, and that pushing further without proper adaptation would put her at serious risk. Solveig turned and looked at Theron. Theron said she was fine. Pasang repeated the recommendation a second time. Theron said he would be sure to include Pasang's reluctance in his post-expedition review. Yep, you heard that right. He threatened his lead guide's professional reputation. Threatened his livelihood, his access to future clients, his career, just to keep pushing his wife up a mountain that was slowly killing her. At Camp 2, 21,300 feet, Marin could not sleep. The expedition records from Pasang's journal note that she was sitting outside the tent at 2 in the morning, facing the Lhotse face, a 4,000-foot wall of blue ice that rises above the western CWM like a frozen skyscraper. She was coughing, and the cough had changed. It was wet now, with a sound like wringing out a sponge. She spat into the snow. No blood yet, but the fluid was thick and concerning. A wet cough at this altitude is never a good sign. By Camp 3, the cough had worsened. Marin pressed her jacket sleeve against her face and turned toward the tent wall. Pasang saw the sleeve later by headlamp. The fabric was damp, and when he held it close, he caught the faint iron smell of. That was the first real sign of high-altitude pulmonary edema HAPE, where the capillary walls in the lungs begin to leak fluid. If untreated, HAPE kills. Not slowly. It can go from concerning to fatal within a matter of hours. Marin had it at 23,000 feet, with more than 4,000 feet of climbing still ahead of her. She did not tell anyone. On the second rotation, the family was supposed to return to base camp before going higher. They did not. Theron had decided that staying high would build acclimatization faster. It does the opposite. The body recovers and adapts during rest at lower elevation, not while being continuously pushed upward. Pasang knew this. He called the base camp manager over the radio and laid out his concerns about the family's condition and their refusal to follow the acclimatization plan. The base camp manager told him the client was always right. Let me just pause on that. The person responsible for the safety logistics of this expedition, speaking to the lead guide who was currently at 23,000 feet watching a 17-year-old bleed into her lungs, said the client was always right. Above Camp 2 on the Lhotse face, climbers ascend steep glacial ice using fixed ropes and mechanical ascenders. During one section of hard blue ice, Solveig stopped moving and clung to the rope, unable to continue while her crampons struggled to gain secure purchase on the surface. She stayed there for 22 minutes while the wind came off the face and the temperature hovered around minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Somewhere in those 22 minutes, she dropped her right glove. It tumbled off the Lhotse face and disappeared. Her bare fingers, in sub-zero temperatures, on a vertical wall of ice at nearly 24,000 feet, developed the white, waxy patches of early frostbite inside of 4 minutes. Pasang climbed down to her from above, removed one of his own spare gloves, and wrapped her hand. He told her they needed to go back down. Theron, watching from 50 feet above, said they would rest at Camp 3. That night, Marin's cough produced bright red blood for the first time, not just pink sputum, but distinct, alarming spots on her sleeve. She pressed her jacket against her face and turned toward the tent wall. The fabric was marked in 3 places. He said that he did not sleep that night. On day 10, bad weather kept all teams at Camp 2. Inside one tent, the Sherpa team discussed the worsening condition of the climbers they were monitoring. Lakpa reported that Solveig's heart rate was rising dramatically with minimal activity, suggesting her body was struggling to cope with the altitude. In his assessment, she was not fit to continue toward the summit. Tendi expressed similar concerns about Marin. Her symptoms, including a wet cough, now with visible blood, fatigue, and progressive deterioration with altitude, were consistent with high-altitude pulmonary edema or HAPE. He believed she needed immediate descent and possibly evacuation, as her condition was continuing to worsen. And then Pasang said what they already knew, what you also probably knew. The father would refuse. The guides agreed on a compromise. They would continue to Camp 4 at the South Col, roughly 26,000 feet, and reassess the family's condition there. Camp 4 lies within the death zone, where the human body can no longer acclimatize and begins to deteriorate. If Solveig or Marin showed any further inability to continue safely, the Sherpas planned to end the summit attempt and prioritize getting them back down the mountain. Pasang knew the father would argue. He also knew something worse, that by the time they reached the South Col, there might not be enough left of the mother or the daughter to argue with. Summit night began on May 16, with climbers leaving Camp 4 at around 10 p.m. in sub-zero temperatures and moderate winds. While conditions were considered acceptable for an ascent, the environment remained extremely hostile and dangerous. 12 climbers from several teams were heading for the summit that night. Under clear skies, a line of headlamps traced the southeast ridge as the climbers slowly ascended through the darkness above the Khumbu Valley. Theron led the rope team. He moved fast in the first hour, burning through glycogen and oxygen reserves that could not be replaced at that altitude. His mask kept fogging because he was breathing through his mouth, a bad habit that made the mask work against him and he never corrected it. He strikes me as a man who didn't correct things when people pointed them out, and that reluctance came from pride. Behind him, Solveig fell back within the first 90 minutes. Her frostbitten right hand could not grip the mechanical ascender that she needed to clip along the fixed lines. She was working entirely with her left hand, which slowed her to a grinding pace. Tendi stayed with her a few paces back, matching her speed and watching every placement of her crampon on the ice. Near the balcony, at about 27,500 feet, Marin's condition turned critical. She had been moving slowly behind her mother, and then she accelerated without warning. She pushed past Solveig and caught up to her father. Her cough was constant now, not occasional, not something she could hide in the darkness, and she left small dark spots on the ice crystals behind her. The spots were blood. She was bleeding into her own airway, and she was still climbing. I think about that a lot. A 17-year-old girl, bleeding from her lungs at 27,000 feet in the middle of the night, just following her father up a mountain because that was what she had always done. Theron reached the balcony, a ledge at about 27,500 feet, where climbers often pause before the final push. While taking a break, he removed his oxygen mask and encountered problems reconnecting it after the system partially froze in the extreme cold. Pasang eventually fixed the issue, but during the delay he noticed signs that concerned him. Theron appeared unusually slow to respond. His hands were shaking, and his appearance suggested he had been affected by a period of reduced oxygen exposure at extreme altitude. Pasang pointed down. Theron shook his head and pointed up. Marn arrived minutes later. She was hyperventilating fast, shallow breaths that were not delivering oxygen efficiently because her lungs were filling from the inside. And then she coughed, and a visible spray of blood hit the interior of her oxygen mask. She looked at it for a moment. Then she wiped the inside of the mask with her glove and adjusted the seal against her face. Pasang grabbed her arm. He pointed at the mask, then at her chest, then down the mountain. He was as clear as language could be without words. And one of the most breathtaking parts in this story for me was this. Maren looked at her father, who was already moving upward. She just followed him. Above the balcony, near the south summit, Solveig suddenly became unable to move normally. She stumbled, struggled to coordinate her movements, and repeatedly failed simple tasks, all signs consistent with severe altitude illness. Recognizing the symptoms, Tendi concluded she was likely developing high-altitude cerebral edema, HACE, a life-threatening condition caused by swelling of the brain at extreme altitude. He radioed Pasang, who instructed him to begin an immediate descent. Tendi turned around with Solveig, but her condition deteriorated rapidly. After only a few steps, she collapsed against the fixed line and could no longer continue on her own. He attempted to lower her using a rope system, but the terrain and her condition made progress extremely difficult, eventually forcing him to stop beside her on the slope. Her pulse was faint and irregular. Her pupils were unequal. One was blown wide in the darkness, which, under those conditions, meant one thing. Her breathing was slow and spaced out. She stopped breathing 47 minutes after she collapsed. Tendi pushed a broken ice axe, blade first, into the snow above her and marked the location. There was no evacuation possible. There was no helicopter coming, no rescue team on its way up the southeast ridge. Solveig Holt died at 28,300 feet, and her body is still there. And at less than 1,000 feet from the summit, Maren stopped. It was not a gradual slowdown. Her legs stopped working, and she sat down in the snow, the way a building sits down during a controlled demolition, suddenly and completely. Her breathing, which had been wet and audible for hours, had changed. It was gurgling, the sound of air moving through liquid. You have to understand that this is the clinical presentation of a lung that has lost the ability to function as a lung. And at 28,500 feet, with no surgical team, no IV diuretics, and no way down fast enough to matter, it means the end is very close. Pasang reached her and tried to lift her. 120 pounds at sea level is nothing. At 28,500 feet, after 9 hours of climbing, with his own supplemental oxygen running low, and his legs already past the point of normal exhaustion, it might as well have been 400. He could not carry her. He called base camp on the radio and told them Maren's condition. The expedition manager, at a comfortable altitude in a heated tent, told Pasang to descend with the father. The daughter was beyond help. Theron heard that transmission. He turned and grabbed Pasang's jacket and pointed up the mountain. His wife was dying on the slope below him. His daughter was sitting in the snow with blood freezing on the inside of her oxygen mask. And he pointed up. How cruel is that? Her eyes were open and aimed at the sky above the south summit. Her coughing had stopped, not because anything had improved, but because the mechanism that was doing the coughing had stopped working. Her breathing came in shallow, irregular waves, with long pauses between them. Maren Holt died on the southeast ridge of Everest at 28,500 feet. She was 17 years old. She had not chosen to be there. Theron kept climbing. I have read through a significant number of expedition accounts from guides and climbers on that mountain. And the thing about this one that stays with me is that Theron Holt knew his wife was dying somewhere below him and had watched his daughter sit down and stop moving, and he kept going up. Whether that was a rational choice at that point is a real question. At 28,000 feet, with no supplemental oxygen and a brain running on fumes, the higher cognitive functions, the ones that evaluate risk, weigh consequences, and allow you to decide not to do something are the first to go. It is possible Theron did not fully understand what he had just seen. It is also possible he understood completely and could not stop. Pasang followed him because he could not leave a client who was still moving. That is the position guides are put in, and it is an impossible one. You cannot physically restrain an adult. You cannot force someone off a mountain. You bear responsibility for them and have almost no actual authority over them, and if you abandon them, the liability falls on you. And so Pasang followed Theron up toward what used to be called the Hillary Step. Near the Hillary Step, climbers encountered a bottleneck while teams worked to clear and re-establish the fixed route through newly accumulated snow. Rather than wait, Theron attempted to climb around the queue on unprotected terrain and slipped on hard ice. He fell a short distance before a backup anchor stopped him. During the fall, his oxygen cylinder was torn loose and lost down the mountainside. Pasang descended to assist him and reconnect him to the fixed line. After assessing the situation, he determined that Theron's loss of supplemental oxygen at nearly 29,000 feet had created a serious emergency. With limited spare oxygen available among nearby teams, reaching the summit was no longer realistic, and the priority became getting him safely back down the mountain. He tried to redirect Theron toward the descent. Theron resisted. For 20 minutes at 29,000 feet, they struggled. Not a physical fight in the traditional sense, but two people in full mountaineering gear at the edge of the functional limit of human altitude, pulling against each other's purpose. Every movement at that elevation costs something that cannot be replaced. 20 minutes of that kind of effort, without oxygen. Think about that. That's not a setback. That's burning whatever Theron had left, and he had almost nothing to begin with. And then he sat down. Not deliberately. He sat down the way a machine powers off. His head dropped forward and then corrected slowly, like a person falling asleep. Pasang tried to lift him 150 pounds of exhausted Sherpa against 220 pounds of unconscious man. He moved Theron 10 feet. Then Theron's eyes opened. They fixed on a point somewhere above Pasang's head, and then they stopped moving. Pasang took a small prayer flag from the inside pocket of his down suit, a printed square of colored cloth about the size of a paperback book, and placed it over Theron's face. Then he turned around and started down. Tendi came down from the south summit alone. He passed the spot where Solveig had died, marked by the ice axe blade, catching the early morning light as the sky began to brighten behind Lotzi. He passed the place on the slope where Marin had sat down. She was curled on her side now, her fingers locked around the zipper of her own jacket in the last thing she had tried to do, the oxygen tank on her back reading empty. Her face mask dark with frozen blood. She had been dead for approximately 2 hours. He could not carry her. No one could have. The Holt family's relatives back in the United States had filed a formal complaint by email, alleging that the Sherpa guides had failed to adequately warn the family of the risks involved. The complaint had been submitted 3 days after the scheduled summit date, when no word had come from the mountain. Pasang looked at the manager for a moment. Then he went to his tent. A formal inquiry was opened by the expedition company. They submitted the complete radio logs, Pasang's written acclimatization plan with its declined recommendations, the base camp manager's recorded transmissions, including the one where he told Pasang the client was always right, and Tendi's documented record of Solveig's oxygen saturation readings going back to Namche. Bizarre. The complaint was dismissed. The guide service did not renew its contract with the base camp manager. The bodies of Theron, Solveig, and Marin Holt remain on the southeast ridge of Everest, where they will remain indefinitely. Pasang returned to Fortse to his 2 children and his elderly mother. He has not guided a climbing expedition since. I can't help but feel that the mountain didn't break the father's arrogance. It just made an innocent guide carry the weight of it forever.